We've been going through this Bleacher Report article on the top NBA duos. And, I mean, Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid, we've been talking for an hour and haven't reached them on the list. They haven't appeared yet. So we got to bring in Jason Fitz, host of First Take, Your Take, and get his take on it from ESPN Radio, because this is an absurd list to go as far as we have, and Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid not cracking. They're not even in the top 12 yet. Haven't even made the top 12. Let's bring in Jason Fitz now here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, and we'll get his take on where, if I just said to you, Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid as a duo, are they top 10 duo in the NBA right now, or outside the top 10?
Oh, they're top 10. Bleacher Report's getting a little cute with it, right? We talked a lot about that article on First Take, Your Take, and, to me, you look at if we're just talking duos, and there's a simple way to figure out your duo. If you were playing NBA jams, who would you want, right? That's it. If I got two guys taking on two guys, who do I want? Simmons and Embiid have to be on that somewhere. In that top 10 range. So I felt like they got a little cute with it, and they're sort of we're forgetting how good that duo could be because the expectations were so dang high, and they haven't been met in so many ways. And so now it just becomes easy to pile on hate for something that really isn't deserving of that.
Yeah, some of these are like, Devin Booker and Ricky Rubio, you're taking ahead of Embiid and Simmons. I like Siakam and Lowry, but still, better than those two guys. Maybe their team's better, but as a duo, that's ridiculous. Chris Paul and Gallinari in the top 10. Jimmy Butler and Bam made the top 10. I thought this, you're right. The fact that you say they got a little too cute, I don't know what sort of the metrics that they use in some of those analytics, but it seems like it went a little too far.
Well, and you mentioned Jimmy Butler and Bam. Is there any team out of the East that's just gotten more unnecessary hype? I feel like over the course of the last month of the NBA season before it was taken from us, what we were watching was everybody give us a million reasons why the Heat were suddenly going to be this next level contender in the East. And I didn't see it then. I don't see it now. And I feel like that's a continuation of what we want, which is some narrative that the Heat are better than they really are.
All right, so you just mentioned that here we are. We hit the pause button. One of the things that you guys discussed, First Take, Your Take, is how your favorite sport should come back. Tournament, some sort of limited season. We're starting to hear, in fact, where we are in Atlantic City is being considered as one of these bubble cities for the NBA to return, which I don't know. I guess it would be cool to say it was here. Not that anybody would be able to go and watch it, but we have the capacity with the hotels to host it. But is that the best way for the NBA to return, with some sort of limited regular season and then full playoffs? How do you think the NBA's best way to come back would be?
Yeah, I think it's a series of games that, frankly, if I was the NBA, I wouldn't even worry about regular season. I'd give us a series of almost like scrimmages, camp sort of thing to make sure everybody's in the right shape. And then I would just take it straight into the playoffs, and that's just being realistic on trying to figure out the best way to reward teams like Memphis, that have fought so hard all year. I feel like you just bring us back into the playoffs. Now, the most innovative suggestions, I got two on the show from callers that were good. They could, difficult to execute, but one was to build a court where everybody could drive up and you could do drive-up NBA playoffs, which would be incredible. You could honk in your horns and still watch games. But more realistic, Vegas came up by a few different people that said, hey, let's put everybody out there in one spot, essentially, quarantine everybody in one hotel, and you give yourself the opportunity to, hotels right now being empty, you could go in and clean it out the way it needs to be cleaned out. And as you do that, then what you give yourself is the opportunity to then play the games in an empty arena in Vegas. Something like that would be a big economic draw for whoever the sponsor is, I would think. Maybe that's an innovative way to do it. But realistically, I think the safest thing and the realest thing for the NBA to do is wait until they know that they can bring it back without any sort of consequence to everybody, and then give us some shortened version of the playoffs.
Fitz, what's the craziest idea that you've heard being discussed about as far as scheduling and ways to bring back leagues like the NBA, Major League Baseball, whenever it starts? We've heard Christmas Day start time for different teams and just crazy scenarios. What's the craziest one you've heard?
I think the craziest scenario, and this actually would be for the NFL, the craziest thing I've heard, well, two, is the thought that we may have to push college football back to summer suddenly because they want to squeeze it in before the fall. And then the concept that the NFL may just wait, if they have to delay until they can play all 16 games, even if it means starting in the dead of winter. And those sorts of reports are a little shocking to me because it means that we're concerned about what the fall is going to look like for all of us and if this is going to come back in some way. But then it also means like just the concept of trying to figure out what it would feel like to watch an Alabama game down in, you're talking the deep, deep South when it's 100 degrees out and humid and they're trying to play a football game in an empty stadium. I mean, that just feels awful to me. It's just like everything about that premise feels like it would actually be tougher for us to watch than easier. So that's been the craziest stuff I've seen.
I was listening to Brian Windhorst talk last night, and he brought up the CBA, the Chinese Basketball Association, their NBA. They're in month 4 of this, and he said one of the factors that isn't being discussed enough is just bringing these leagues back, bringing these games back too soon. And one case circling back up to the surface here and then having to shut it back down. Is that a fear that you've been hearing a lot from fans and your listeners and what you've talked about?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest fear for everybody, and the reason we're starting to see long-term cancellations, I mean, part of the conversation around Wimbledon being canceled today, and I talked to Patrick McEnroe on the show, was, why now? Why make the decision now? And realistically, they have to make these decisions now because what they don't want to do is put themselves in a situation where they try and it doesn't work. I think that becomes even more haunting for everybody at some level. And they're trying to figure out ways that they can do this where we're only impacted once. I mean, if they actually turn around and suddenly have to play a few games and then recancel, what does that do to the overall sort of psyche and moment to all of us? I realize we're desperate for sports. It's not just sports. I always lean back to my music background. I mean, we're desperate for concerts. Look, we're watching people sing on their couches and we're turning it into the greatest thing we've ever seen in our lives, right? Like, that's where we are right now. We're just desperate for escapism. But what we have to be careful of is if you decide that we're going to bring these things back and all of a sudden it makes the situation worse or it sets us back, now all of a sudden we are getting into long term. And if we start getting into the fourth quarter of the year, that becomes even scarier financially for everybody.
Jason Fitz, First Take, Your Take, ESPN Radio. What about baseball and the conundrum they're in? We've heard ideas about playing the World Series in like Christmas Day and playing. Does a neutral stadium work for the World Series?
I think a neutral site could be fun for the World Series as a one-time, one-off, because if you're a baseball purist and you love the sport, you're going to go to the one World Series that is sort of like the Super Bowl. It's being played in this city at this time. I think being there could be a really cool moment, but it's hard for me to figure out how baseball separates from everything else at that time of year. And that's the part that for me just doesn't necessarily compute. I mean, are we really going to want to pay attention to a neutral site World Series in the middle of December when you've got not only the holidays going on, but you've got football and college football at their peak right then? That's hard for me to really believe people be in for it.
Last one for Jason Fitz. We got NFL playoff expansion. Right or wrong? You like it? I mean, it adds some, obviously, it adds some sizzle to the number 1 seed. But at the back end of it, it adds possibly a little bit of, 8 and 8-ish.
Well, here's the thing, though. It adds 8 and 8, and I know we all want to talk about how 8 and 8 just isn't. We don't want to reward mediocrity, but everybody knows that feeling in November, December when you wake up on Sunday morning and your team still has a shot at the playoffs. We hate the thought of a mediocre team getting into the playoffs until it's our favorite team, and then we love every ounce of it. So, to me, if as a Raiders fan, you all know that, like I'm used to a terrible football team that likely doesn't have a shot at the playoffs. So, if I've got a reason to wake up and watch games on Sundays in the fall where I can look at it and think that my favorite team has a real shot at the playoffs, I want that. And I want everybody else to feel that too. So I love everything about the playoff expansion. I have no problems with it. I think it's going to end up giving everybody more fire in December, and I'm all in for that.
All right, Jason Fitz, First Take, Your Take. And, of course, he joins us here each week on the Boardwalk Honda Guest Hotline as we continue to have a little fun. That duo list has been a lot of fun to get into, the NFL expansion, and then, of course, the way that the NBA might come back, possibly even here in Atlantic City. Good stuff this week, Jay.
Hey, you guys have a great week. Stay safe.
You do the same. Jason Fitz, and, of course, you heard him today here on 97.3 ESPN. You hear him every Wednesday here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.